Hello, today is January 14th, 2020. This is the standard C cluster lifecycle call. I will share my screen. If you want to add your details to the meeting notes, that would be helpful. And also, as always, if you have group topics, please add them to the end of the list. So I've only got a couple. GSP, okay. I've only got a couple of things to talk about today in the global side, but if folks have other things that they want to talk about, please amend them to the list. So we have a problem. Justin and I and Lubomir have been chatting back and forth. Apparently, there's some constraints that exist at KubeCon, and Sync Cluster Lifecycle has had a number of separate talks that they've traditionally had for any given cycle during KubeCon. But Nancy, in trying to prune things down, realized that we shouldn't have been doing what we've been doing, even though we've been doing it for years. So I've been talking with Dan, and I need to talk with the CNCF folks again to figure out what's a good policy that we should try to adhere to. So far, I threw out the idea of having possibly 2 to 3 talks per Sync Cluster Lifecycle for deep dives. Having one intro talk, which is good in general because it kind of highlights all of the sub-projects of Sync Cluster Lifecycle, but then having 2 or 3 deep dives, and we'll have to do a rotational policy on our side. So as we go to different KubeCons, we talk about the different sub-projects as we rotate them around. Now, that's kind of a little bit thorny because that doesn't mean we always will get a talking slot. So there might be other options or opportunities for us to do BOF sessions or get some other shared space somehow for us to do face-to-face things. So I want to pause there for a second and see what other people's thoughts or opinions are with regards to this.
I'll raise my physical hand. I just want to say we did a face-to-face for add-ons in San Diego, and I thought that was like one of my favorite bits of KubeCon. The group size worked well. It was about, I think, 10 or 15 people. We started over lunch and then we broke off into a table, and I think we really had some very good discussions, and we all got to know each other a little bit better. And I thought that was really, in some ways, better than a talk in terms of understanding where everyone was coming from. I don't know if it would have worked if there had been three or 4 times as many people, for example. So at that size, it worked pretty well, but it was great. And so I would love to see us get some space for that. I think that's super useful.
So quick questions about this. Was that done during the contributor summit timing, or was that done during the actual KubeCon?
It was done during KubeCon, but it was like a Tuesday lunchtime, if I recall correctly. So it was a random day for lunch. We met for lunch. That was outside. There were helicopters and stuff flying overhead. So we moved inside and we snuck into a room, which, as this meeting is not being recorded, I will say was the Ambassador's Lounge, and we used that.
It is recorded.
Oh.
The secret's out.
I know.
Chris told us to do it. So.
I think that's actually a reasonable timing, and I actually kind of like the logistics around that of having an ad hoc lunch face-to-face conversations, because the lunch period is fairly large, and it's a good excuse to sit down and chat together. I think that from a logistics perspective, it'd be ideal if we actually had a room that had things like dry erase boards or something where people could sketch out ideas. I think I agree with you that I'd find it more useful, and we could even highlight those as part of our intro talk too, if we had it during KubeCon, if we had logistics specified for face-to-face sessions.
Is that something that we would list on the schedule? Because stuff that's going to get listed in the same places and talks is going to get hundreds of attendees.
I don't think it'll be in the same place. I think it'll be, and to be honest, I wouldn't want it to be. I want it to be the contributors, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
so maybe it's during KubeCon, but listed under the Contributors Summit event.
I don't even know if it'd be listed there. I think it
Yeah,
would be, we would have our talks highlighted, and we would highlight those face-to-face sessions as part of our talks for people who are actually want to actively contribute.
cool. Because we didn't do a talk during the Contributor Summit for every project because we did those in the maintainer track. So I guess just when we do our SIG cluster lifecycle update or whatever ancillary talks at the summit, we would talk about the face-to-faces.
Yes. So like the main, I think for all the talks, like if we get 2 or 3 accepted for deep dives, that we should try to highlight the other things that are ongoing as as things come out. Usually the intro talk is always on the first day. So the intro talk is the big awareness for people who might not know or who might want to be like new to this space and want to contribute. I think that'd be a great time for them to sit
Okay.
down and get to know people. And it gives them a low barrier to entry, easy access to a lot of the core contributors, and we could get them on ramped and answer questions there. So I like that idea. Do folks have other thoughts? Are there any, like, I know for some people, the getting the talk on the maintainer track has always been like an excuse for their employer to send them to KubeCon, which is I sometimes try to rotate it around just so that I make sure that people get a chance to go, because I know that budgets are tight and stuff like that. And I think because if you're actively contributing to this project, trying to get people to go to KubeCon is a good thing. I've never heard anyone go to a KubeCon and sort of say like, it was the worst time ever, right? Usually it's a great excuse, an opportunity to meet the people that you see virtually in disembodied heads on your computer on a weekly basis. So I think we'll have to do a rotation. With that said, what I wanted to do down below is like we will definitely have a deep dive. I do think that SCL chairs should be the ones doing the deep dives because they have the most domain experience, knowledge, et cetera, on what's going on, as well as like they're kind of the ambassador, right? The chairs should be the ambassador, the public figureheads that people go to if they ask questions, comments, want to know more about SCL. I'm not going to KubeCon EU, so I've thrown Lemire and Justin under the bus for doing the intro talk this year. But so I think that one's filled out. I've already submitted it, honestly. So if Justin and Lemire didn't get the email, the one is coming. The next question though is like, what deep dives do you want to touch on? And this is the hard conversation. What deep dives do you want to touch on for KubeCon EU?
And to clarify, presumably if a sub-project gets a EU slot, they would not get the NA, the North America slot.
Well, it's going to be rough because like some projects we do want to highlight because they're so transformative, right? But I do think that we should rotate. So like if we do a KubeADM talk, for example, KubeADM's been around a long time, that we should rotate that project around with something else for North America. Right?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question. Like there are some big projects that people may expect to see, right? Like the attendees may want to see them, but at the same time, we also want to encourage people to like see all the projects. So it's a difficult balancing act. I
know it's rough. This is the hard part. Like I opened with the easy one. So I really do want to, Cluster API is front and center for a lot of the things we're doing nowadays. I do want to highlight that because a lot of the sub-projects below it could potentially leverage it, right? I do want to get a mix of cross-employers working on those deep dives. I'd like to have 2 where possible, so it's not just one figurehead company trying to promote their agenda. I wanted to have like multiple participants. So I talked with Raphael and Ross about KubeADM deep dive. I think if folks they're both European zone folks, I think it's good for the EU folks to have representation there and be engaged. So I think that's a good one. Cluster API, I don't know who you put your name down, Vince, but I think Nadir said he wanted to earlier. So I don't know who's, there can only be one VMware employee and then we have to get somebody else.
I'm not, like, I'm leaving it. Like, if nobody goes, like, I would go, but like, I'd rather not do this with KubeCon.
Nadir, are you still on? We can't hear you, Nadir.
Yeah, so I probably won't be going North America, and Europe's only a train ride away, so almost certainly will be going to Amsterdam.
Right. So let's add Nadir's name here, but I would like to get someone else from another company engaged, hopefully European friendly, and not one of the people who have talked yet before. So if you've talked already, like I know Vince has talked already, right? Like if you've talked already, like try to opt out, try to get a rotational policy for other folks to go to as well, because it's good to have that experience, given the talk, going there, getting engaged. Now, if that's two of the talks, right? Because we have two European-friendly groups. The question is like, what's going to be the third talk, and what do we have to give up?
I guess it's a little hard to quantify interest, right? Like, because probably want to do a talk that's like, or like rotate the talks that like have most interest, but how to quantify that? I don't know if we have metrics on dev stats, but maybe we can use that.
We could do that. We haven't set up a criteria for how we want to evaluate it. I think we need to figure out a policy for sure, so we're fair. So I think an action item for me is to start to like, as well as Justin Lubomir, is to start to craft what is the rotational policy that is fair for the group. But you know, there's a lot of other sub-projects. There's Minikube, there's COPS, there's technically KubeSpray, but they have not been attending this meeting in forevers. There's the component config work, but that's more of a working group. Actually, I think working groups can have their own sessions. So I'd say Lee, and there's add-ons too. I'd say Lee, you should submit the component config independently. And mention that you're, what?
Hi guys, this is Midya. It's the first time I'm attending this meeting. I'm from Minikube team, and we actually have two talks we want to fit in the KubeCon. One of them is about Kick. We recently merged Kubernetes in containers, the biggest feature we wanted to do in Minikube, and we have been doing it with very differently, and we'd like to share it with KubeCon.
I'm not going to KubeCon, so I don't have a stake in this fight really. But I want to hear from other people that, like Justin, what are your thoughts about COPS versus Minikube? Do you have, I don't want to pit you guys against each other, but I also want to.
I was just failing to type repeatedly in an embarrassing fashion that like we just gave a big talk in December, right, in San Diego, where we had like 9 out of 10 maintainers or whatever, you know, like really good attendance. So I feel like we're not particularly bothered about doing one in March, and we'd much rather do it much later in the year so we can actually prepare for it. I think like there is interest in like hosting the face-to-face around some of the topics that are particularly EU relevant, but yeah, I don't want to take like also with a deep dive. I also feel bad about like if someone else really wants a slot, I don't want to take someone's slot. But yeah, I see the desire to be like ambassadors, so that makes sense. On the idea of having 2 talks, I suspect that would be a real push for Minikube. You could maybe, I think the submission is closed, but like Kik could have been a good like talk, right?
Yeah, so technically the way the maintainer track works is you get an intro and some number of deep dives based upon what SIG you live in. And for us, we have to pick between 2 to 3 sub-projects to do a deep dive. So in this case, if we did kubeadm, cluster API, and Minikube, that would preclude us from, you'd only get 1 deep dive talk. We could not submit 2. So unless you get your talk accepted for the main track, there would be no other deep dive session. There would be 2 talks in the maintainer track.
Tim, did you mention that component standard should submit through the?
Yeah, I would say submit independently because there was like a weird loophole. Not that I was looking for exit strategies. There was a weird loophole that existed inside of Nancy's email where working groups are technically not housed by SIG. Some projects are, and working groups span SIGs. And as such, a working group could get its own talk independently.
And
So
this is for KubeCon or for the Contrib Summit?
For the maintainer track at KubeCon.
For the maintainer track, okay. Because yeah, we were chatting about that this morning. So I will. Has she opened up submissions for that already?
Yeah, the email has gone out. I don't know if I forwarded it to the group. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, working groups are independent than SIGs. So working groups and user groups are independent, can host 1 session. So you can have an independent session because you're a working group. So let me forward this to you.
Thanks.
You just open the floodgates.
Well, yeah, everyone's going to switch now to become their own working group, right? So like the whole purpose of having SIG's own sub-projects was to like collapse the org chart of Kubernetes because it was SIG sprawl, right? And now because they're doing this, it forces other things to happen. People are going to gamify the system. Lee, what's your email address? If you could paste it in chat.
CAPILEIGH@gmail.
Can you just put it in chat just in case?
Oh yeah.
Of
course.
Right. So Midya, has Thomas moved on from other things? Is he working on other stuff now?
No, he's still working on Minikube, but I will be taking more of his plate, and I will be the TL for Minikube.
Okay.
But he would be still contributing and acting, but he will be taking more other things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, if we submit for Minikube, that would be the 3rd talk. Are there other talks that folks really want to submit?
So the thing is, our real talk that we want to submit is the one that me and Jose Donizetti want to do, the Kik. But he also submitted the Priya and Rohit talk as well. That one, we intended that as like an intro to Minikube, and this one as like a deep dive.
So you don't get 2. It only
Yeah.
gets 1.
So could we still update which one we could?
You have until next week, Monday, but I can only submit 1 for Minikube,
Yeah.
so from the maintainer track. So, and it would be a deep dive. So usually in your deep dive, you do the first 5 minutes doing like overview, what is Minikube for new people? And we also do an intro session where we cover the sub-projects, not in too much detail as part of the intro session.
Yeah. Yeah, we could come up with 1 and submit just 1.
So usually they have to come from me. So I will do the submission for you, but I need to know what's the talk name and title, and then I need to know who are the people and what's your email address.
I'll update you in very in a few days.
And I am on the SIG Cluster Lifecycle channel, so just poke at Timothy SC, and I will do that.
Excellent.
Any other topics that folks want to discuss? Now, this also means that if you sign up for the KubeCon EU session, that means we're going to have to rotate you. I think the only exception that I want to add to this rule might be Cluster API because of the high profile nature and its nascent, it's fast moving clip that it's at. It's such a high profile thing for this SIG that I want to make sure that we highlight it as part of every cycle where possible until we get it more matured. What do folks think about that? That's my personal opinion.
I actually agree with that. I think it makes a ton of sense. I feel like it's probably the one where people are like, there's the most change, I'd say, or the most like user-facing change, maybe. So at least for North America, right? Based on current progress. Like that's not going to be the case in 10 years, fingers crossed, but.
Agreed. I think once things have matured to GA, for even for Cluster API, I do want to highlight things that aren't getting enough limelight over time, because I think that people gravitate towards the shiny, right? Because it may solve a set of problems, but I think there's a set of things that we need to solve as a community that aren't always glorious that I think are super important. All right, this was surprisingly easier than I thought it was going to be. So we'll highlight this, and one of the things I will talk with Nancy and Dan about is I will try to figure out logistics about face-to-face sessions to see if we can get some meeting rooms that are during like the lunch period times, and see if we can try to get some logistics nailed down there and see if it'll work out for folks.
I just realized, that there are no talks scheduled during lunch, so there are a large number of meeting rooms that are available rather.
Exactly, right. So I think finding a room that's convenient for folks to actually do a face-to-face, I think would be a good thing. So I will send an email and update to Nancy and Dan and see what they come back with. All right. Before we get into the sub-project updates, are there any other things that folks wanted to discuss as a larger group? You guys are great. This was easy. I thought we were gonna maybe have a holy war, but it turns out everyone's pretty copacetic. All right, let's get into sub-project updates and working groups. Thanks for the change. COPS, want to go first?
Sure, yes. I think the most interesting thing, from a cross-project perspective is to date, COPS did not have a deprecation policy. So in theory, you could install like Kubernetes 1.5 or 1.4 using COPS. And we have all these like if statements scattered throughout our code to be like, if Kubernetes is less than or equal to 1.6, for example. We are introducing a deprecation policy. And I think what's most relevant is because we are introducing it where we didn't have one before, we don't want to like egregiously break people. And so we are like, I think we're starting with like 10 releases back, which is a much bigger number than we want to land on, but at least lets us remove 1.6, for example, which is a good start. I would encourage others that are considering this, that don't yet have a deprecation policy, to adopt this, to think about a deprecation policy for old code. And it is certainly going to clean up the COPS code base a lot. No one really cares about Kubernetes less than or equal to 1.6 at this time, particularly as it doesn't get security updates. And we know that like people shouldn't be running the old versions. And yes, we've talked to them and they know this, but we have to sort of deal with reality. So I thought that was interesting.
So just so I chime in and have some conversation piece here, like kubeadm officially follows the Kubernetes maintenance cycle, for lack of a better term, where we do N-3 right? So you do 117, 116, and 115. With that said, like we should probably codify this into a document that is explicit because almost invariably, as you mentioned, there are folks in the wild who are like, my cert's expired. Like, we did this on purpose because we knew you were going to try to run this forever. You should upgrade your cluster. And you know, just to codify a policy from SIG cluster lifecycle. Any thoughts there?
I think we'll find it will be more than 3, but yes, we're trying to get. I think if we get to 6, we'll be happy. But it's a tough discussion to have with end users, as it were.
It is. We do see this in the wild all the time, where people use it in perpetuity without updating for much longer cycle than we'd expect.
I'd also clarify, COPS has like a soft deprecation. So we say like, you're running a version which we really don't recommend, but if you pass an environment variable, you can continue to do so. Like, I acknowledge this is just inconvenient right now. It's Black Friday, right? I want to update right now, that sort of thing. And this is a hard deprecation where we actually remove the code and there is no way around it other than to run an older version of COPS.
I think what I will do is I'm going to log an issue in the community repo as an action item. And for us to start to formalize, as we have at the top of this doc, there are group topics. That we should start to formalize some of this as an official policy of the SIG, just to prevent us from getting into our own mired in its support hell forever. Any other questions? Next up, add-ons. Either Justin or Lee.
Oh, we had somebody join us last meeting who built an open source solution for packaging air-gapped installation of Kubernetes, really simple UX. It's built on top of Kubedium, and they had interest in making sure that the add-ons work that we've been putting together, would be integratable. And they were super friendly and introduced themselves, so we were grateful to field that meeting with them. We chatted a little bit about the operators that we want to be able to ship, and then these folks also packaged a bunch of customized directories for a pretty wide array of add-ons. And then Jeff and them set up a time to chat so that we could talk about action items next week. And I'm in like rebase hell, and that's about it. Justin, is there anything to add?
I don't think so. I think that was the main highlight. We're sort of getting back into the swing of things after the break.
We had a discussion on component config usage and what the correct thing to do is when providing a library, and whether or not the object should be versioned or not for the library input. That was interesting. Yeah.
I'd love to get like maybe a demo walkthrough of at this SIG meeting periodically of some of the sub projects to basically highlight some of the cool things that we talk about, because we've never really done that. I think that would be a good thing, and maybe like we could rotate through the sub projects for demos, because I'd be very curious to see where the add-on sub project is and where component config is nowadays, and what are the key blockers, and try to see if we can, as a group, collectively either address things or applaud some of the good work that's been done.
I second that notion. I think that'd be great, and we could learn from each other and say like, this was a disaster or this worked well, type of thing.
Yeah. Just to call it out, do you think maybe next week or next SIG meeting we can maybe do an add-ons demo?
Yeah, I could do that.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Lee. I'll put it to the agenda next time.
Oh, well, I'm not going to be able to do it because I won't be here. I just realized that. So maybe not add-ons next week, maybe the week after.
I'm also going to be AWOL in 2 weeks.
Great. How about most people, does everyone know or have been involved in Cluster API that isn't on this call? Because we could, they're always doing demos all the time. So I think maybe doing a highlight here of some of the key things that they've done, not necessarily from the, like, here's what Cluster API does. That's interesting. A lot of people know those things. But I think what are some of the key lessons learned maybe in like API coverage, test automation, what are the key cool things that are being done there so that way we can actually leverage that across other sub-projects?
Something like the tilt development environment that might be useful for general projects.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think we've had a demo of that.
We did have a demo, but I think demoing it here in this forum and getting recorded, I think would be good. Because there's a lot of people here who are sub-project leads of other areas, and seeing that automation would be good. Because they don't always go to the Cluster API meeting.
So I guess we'll just sign Chuck up for that.
Right.
I'm kidding. He's not here to. I don't think he's here to defend himself.
He's not, but you said it. Blame Daniel.
Oh no.
All right. Next up, speaking of Cluster API, Vince, you want to go?
Sure. So we did 2 releases last week, and which fixed 2 bug fixes. Like in Cluster API, we have 029, which the like machine set, like now we need to decluster 1 orphan resources. Speaking of like the template resources that you attach to a machine set or machine deployment. And for Kappa, instead, like we have a new feature that passes like the instance tags to the volumes that you have attached to the instance. And it also fixes a null pointer exception when we can't get the root device size from AWS. So pretty important bug fixes there. On any questions? For V1 Alpha 3, we have good progress across all fronts. Control plane, we have scale up and create capabilities there. And Daniel has a PR out for delete, which I think it should be almost ready. So there has been like a great progress there. And Cluster Cuddle, Fabrizio, he's here. Do you want to give like an overview? I think, well, the TLDR is like we're trying to use Cluster Cuddle also in our dev environment right now, like maybe alongside Tilt sometimes when you don't need like fast iteration. Yeah, like a few of us have tried it out and like have been reporting bugs that we have found. We're trying to set a tentative date for an RC1 for V1 Alpha 3, and we'll probably discuss this in tomorrow's meeting, but we're probably aiming at like mid-February, like a month from now, for an RC1, and this will give time also for infrastructure providers to update, and I'm also checking with the Azure folks to make sure that like they're up to date and they have all the support they need to push to V1 Alpha 3. We're also doing kind of like drawing a plan of action to automate all the things related to automation, given that release automation is kind of like one of the biggest problems right now. It takes like more than an hour to do 2 releases across Kappa and Kappa. And so getting tired of that, like we're trying to automate all of that with Prow and GitHub Actions working together. One thing that I wanted to highlight here is like we might need to work on like some more like a better policy on like when it's time to like do proposals and when it's time to do a freeze to do code. So if anybody has like examples or ideas that like we can bring to Cluster API, please send them to me, and I'll make sure to like either discuss it tomorrow or next week.
I think one of the things we talked about too for Cluster API was to have this long-standing backlog of high-level features. I think a problem that Cluster API I think suffers from is that we go through this longer phase in the beginning of a cycle where people draft new proposals. I would fully, and the way the main KK works is proposals get drafted all the time and people work on things asynchronously. So like you just accept certain proposals once they feel it's reached a certain point of maturity. So that's the typical modus operandi for the rest of KK. And you get in what you can get in for a cycle, provided people are going to devote time, energy, and resources towards getting those things done. So if those proposals are ready to go, then you have a X week period where you can create new proposals and then you lock down. And then that's what's going to be in a release. And that's just the way it's going to go.
Yeah, I guess like the question is more like how do we define those time frames, and like at which point in time like the proposals was late for the next iteration, right? Like because we want to make sure that like we're inclusive, but at the same time we need to make sure that like a release is kind of like scoped down to what we can do rather than like what we want to do.
I need to write
I'll
my
draft
docs
something.
again. Yeah, I think this should be public facing. Like this should be best practices. Like we should put this in general in the mains Sync Cluster Lifecycle community channel, because despite what Cluster API, Cluster API, you're special, but you're not. You're special now, right? And so like this problem is generic. It happens for everybody, right? So we should.
I'll draft something up.
Any other questions? Lee, components good standard.
Cool. Yeah, so there was quite a large thread that started up on Twitter, and Ian Coldwater like sounded the klaxons and everybody showed up and started talking about config usability. Basically, a user was trying and unsuccessfully like finding the non-existent documentation for component configs with kubeadm, and that got us into several threads of conversation. I brought that up as a follow-up in our working group. We chatted about that for a second. It's important that we prioritize config generation. Obitech, who's worked on a lot of stuff already, has an interest in picking this up. Somebody else should come and help him. And then that same person, Alex Snipping, he is working on the kube controller manager config. You can see some of his progress updates in this Google Doc. And yeah, he's working on making sure that the current structs that are in the code are serializable. Mike wrote an excellent KEP on instance-specific config that you should go check out. There are still a small number of open questions on this, just like what should the usability, what should the UX be for the components to expose, and whether or not we should have flags that do merging or not, just how flexible that should be. Seems like you're taking a look at the KEP. Then we also had a small discussion on conversions of many to one and one to many kinds in API version upgrades and group moves and things like that. This is something that has happened before with config, and the prior art is mostly like this hacky stuff that we did in kubeadm when we wanted to split out the API, and you can see the recording of that. Very interesting work, very heavy in component config right now. So
cool. Any questions for Lee?
I have a question. Lee, do you discuss it also about the conversion public to public?
We did not discuss that this meeting. Do you have something that you'd like me to follow up with?
Yeah, the problem is that we are starting to, we are splitting up a repository in order to allow the user to consume only the configuration, so to vendor only the configuration for one project. But then there is the problem that the user want to convert from one version to the other, and all the conversion code is still internal. And so we are kind of blocked in moving the component config from one version to another, because we are not successful in providing a conversion path to the users.
My honest intuition here is that we should try to convince component maintainers to have their internal types be part of an external repository. But so that we don't have to so we don't have to vendor all of KK. Because yeah, it's a significant burden to be writing the external to external conversions for every API. But yeah, I can bring that up for next week or the week after with working group, because I won't be there next week. I'll put that on the agenda.
So with regards to discoverability and API documentation, like I do realize that GoDoc is not the best answer, but I also realize that I want to make sure that this publicly recorded meeting has the right vernacular here. It is very stressful or difficult for us to be able to export APIs versus hosting them for things that we care about. I think it'd be better for us to maybe link to the main documentation, so that way we could actually have like a link to the Kubedium config that we would, netlify or do whatever we want to do, so we can maintain that API documentation. But we don't have a central authority for all of the potential APIs that are not standard APIs, right?
Yeah, that does not exist yet. And the generation of the tooling for that isn't final or built, or no one really knows how it works in that context. But yeah, I think we would have a separate site that we could link out to.
Right. Maybe we should follow up on that one next time, because that's a common problem. People ask all the time about like what these fields mean and do, and how do I edit them, and what's the contract, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think just even as devs who work directly in the project on these APIs, we have the same issue. So,
right. Any other questions? Next up, Daniel at CDADM.
Yeah, first, I just want to say that we are definitely looking for new contributors, especially having additional reviewers would be helpful, even if you're not especially interested in contributing code, but are interested in etcd and sort of that side of things. Yeah, please ping me or directly or on the etcd-ADM channel. Because there are like over the holidays, I was out and there are some outstanding PRs that I've yet to get to, and anyway, it'd be great to have more reviewers. I'm sure that's true for for all the sub projects. And then yeah, the next sort of up on my task list is working on the API types, but I'm currently doing some things with cluster APIs, so that's next on the queue. And something interesting that I've seen, I've gotten a ping about someone who is interested in I guess a company interested in using cluster API, but also having separate machines for etcd, and wanting to figure out how to use etcd-ADM for that. And that's something that Justin and I have talked about also in in recent meetings. I'm sure that soon, I think once the control plane management piece lands in cluster API, we can start thinking about, okay, how you know, how or whether, you know, where the sort of the separate etcd clusters can fit in with Cluster API, and where etcd-ADM can fit in as well.
Yeah. I think the separate managed etcd is very analogous to the load balancer, where like you could POC some types in management layer independently, and we could always see if it makes sense, and then maybe have a separate contrib section where you could have these concepts as part of Cluster API, but not like fully part of the main API, because they're separate entities, right? It's debatable. There's a couple ways you can slice this, but you know, I think that's part of. I talked with the Cluster API folks. Make sure that they're in the loop.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. Next up, KubeADM, Fabrizio.
Really quick update. So we are starting to get ready for the announcement phase. So reworking all the open announcement and giving updates and so forth. I want to point out all the audience here to the cap that Lubomir wrote about moving kubeadmin out of KK. Feedback are welcome. This is a really complex and interesting operation that we are going to tackle this cycle. And also to point out to you to kubeadmin, developing kubeadmin 101, a video that we created in order to help a new contributor to jump in. That's all for me.
Any questions for Fabrizio?
Yes, I have one question related to the kubeADM operator. If there's kind of any plans to kind of get that going again, or if it's, yeah, just a status update on the kubeADM operator.
Oh, we have to all the scaffolding in place. We have to start implementing. Currently, it is lagging a little bit of contribution due to other priorities, and there is no plan because basically no well-defined plan because basically it is a prototype. But if you are interested in something special, please reach out to me. So we try to understand what we can do.
So the reason I ask is in conjunction with the Cluster API control plane upgrade / downscale. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have an upgrade yet for Cluster API. And it seems to me that there's an overlap here that potentially we can kill two birds with one stone. But
the cluster, is Vince still on? Cluster API upgrade is part of the V1 Alpha 3, correct? But that's immutable.
That's going to be part of the control plane, yes.
Yeah.
But only if you're using the control plane.
Yeah, and then if you want immutable in-place upgrades, that's where the kubeADM operator comes into place.
Well, they're very similar from an orchestration perspective. The steps are pretty much the same.
Kind of. They're slightly different. There's definitely a difference in immutable versus mutable, because you have to take etcd members out versus keeping them in line. There's a couple of other things that you need to deal with in an immutable infrastructure that you don't have to deal with when you just mutate. But we specifically wanted to keep them separate because we want to make sure that Cluster API doesn't grow unbounded.
Okay.
And it's Bootstrapper specific, right? So. I do think we should get back to the kubeADM operator in the near-term future after we've kind of solidified plans of getting it out of tree. Next up, Vidya.
Yes. So One of the exciting things that we emerged this week was the experimental version of VM-free driver, Docker driver. So now you can run Minikube in Docker as opposed to in a VM. And the exciting thing about it is we treat the Docker container just like the VM we would. So we have most of the Minikube's functionalities, like such as add-ons or whatever cool things that we had, tunnels and mounts, and we are working on mounts. And the second thing is we created this tool in the hackathon called GoPoke, and we converted our test logs to HTML, which is much more readable and searchable. And we improve our integration test flakes by using a better locking mechanism. And that's very exciting. And we have a much more reliability inside Minikube. Previously, we had tried to fix integration tests, but now we actually made Minikube so reliable in parallel. So if you run hundreds of Minikubes in parallel, it would be so low chance of conflicts. So that would improve reliability for the user as well. We have Istio add-on. We are working on multi-node. We are making an initial PRs. We had the demo on multi-node in KubeCon, but we are breaking it down to smaller PRs, and hopefully you will see a multi-node before next KubeCon. And the last thing on my mind is, I don't know if you guys have seen Thomas's Tea Party triage app he created for Minikube that helps us triage better. We like to also increase the community engagement of triage. So the first step for that would be measuring how much people help in reviewing PRs or closing issues or responding to issues. And that would be a great way to measure and include that in our release notes as a thank you to the people who participated in the community triage. This is just something we want to do, but we haven't done it yet. So if you guys also have done something similar, I would love to hear your ideas as well. How do you engage more or encourage more community in your triage process?
So several comments. Let's start from the backwards up.
Yeah.
So I know that Thomas said he was working through open sourcing Tea Party. Do you know if that's open source now?
He's working on it. I don't know. I don't think he has finished the process for that yet.
Ideally, we would love to have, like, as someone who spans, I don't even know how many years have been working on this. Justin, how old are we?
I think it's 5, isn't it? 5 or 6?
Yeah. So in Kubernetes years, we're like 50. I don't know. But the triaging has been a problem, and I saw his tool as a potential win for how to deal with this across multiple repositories. So I'd be very interested in evaluating it and kicking the tires on it. We have, as a community, we have not done the best of effort to highlight those who do the unglorious skunt work of making sure everything is in a milestone, making sure that it's actionable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a lot of work. As a SIG lead, as a SIG chair, I can attest to the sheer amount of GitHub finagling that I do is fantastico. That's pretty much my job.
One idea was like I had that if people sign up for a triage duty for a week, so you could go on rotations voluntarily, we could measure the amount of comments they have done during that period on a specific repo and count that as their triage activity.
Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to talk about is that the Venn diagram overlap of Minikube and Kind were kind of like this, and now they're approaching this, right? I've always said that I've wanted to put Minikube and Kind into a meat grinder because users don't want to choose; they just want to have like a knob that they twist, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, have you been working with Ben and James to try and approach a steady roadmap that everyone agrees that this is a good plan for the record? Because I think the big win that Kind had was for CI test automation. That was the huge win because we had the Docker and Docker approach for us to be able to actually get CI integration for Kubernetes, for like CRDs or whatever, right? You can be able to integrate Kind directly into your workflow. And that's this hugely powerful thing. But as you start to add these features, your Venn diagram overlap of feature set is approaching the same core set of features. So my question to you would be have you been talking with Ben regularly to try and figure out a roadmap, maybe of convergence?
Yeah, I would love to see that. I mean, we have reached out to Ben a few times. I think Thomas also reached out to Ben a few times.
Mm-hmm.
On the Minikube side, there's been a feature that people wanted for a long time, and for us, we already had a driver mechanism, and Docker was just another driver.
Mm-hmm.
In implementation, there wasn't really that much of implementation that we had to go through to make it happen. The biggest part of this experience is, I would say, the user part of it. How we handle the user is harder than spinning up Kubernetes inside a container. And when I first tried to work on it, I started with prototyping with Kind, but it had a lot of limitations that Minikube had already solved, and I didn't want those limitations. For example, running in different kind of runtimes you want to do either Podman or Docker, not be bind to just Docker, or be able to have our add-on system or our tunnel or handling the Minikube. I think one of the things that is very popular is because it handles users in different countries very well, like in China or India, or countries very slow internet or not access to different websites. So if we detect you're in a country that doesn't have access, for example, to GCR, we automatically detect, for example, a different GCR for your countries. There's a lot of details that Minikube does, and I think that's the hard part of it. Spinning up Kubernetes container was the easiest part of it. I would love to see convergence in these two projects, and I would be up for doing that.
Yeah, I think maybe I can broker a conversation between everybody to sit down and talk about it, because I don't have a real stake in the fight. You know, I just want to have one thing that I tell people to go to. What I care about is consistency and reproducibility, and so long as it's KubeADM based, I don't care. Yeah, and it's fast, right? What I care about is reproducibility, speed, and the ability to integrate test automation with it.
One thing that I also like to mention, we did reuse the Kind space image, the container space image, and the rest of it is just starting that container just like the way we would do the VM. So there was no really much of the duplicate work. So I would say the base image that Kind has produced, the Ubuntu base image with the right amount of tools, was very valuable, and that could still be something that we reuse and develop together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will leave it at that, but I'll take an action item to maybe set up a conversation with whoever on the Minikube side you think is appropriate, and with Ben and possibly James, to see if we can try to get convergence. Because the idea of having two tools that overlap in features and functionality from a community perspective only breeds conflict. So I would ideally like to have a single set of tools that we use across the test automation that we're creating, so that way it's a common building block or set of building blocks that has a layered approach that we can use for different user stories. Because that's the model of Sync Cluster Lifecycle, right? The model of Sync Cluster Lifecycle is we build a tool set, the tools are composable and layered, you pick the pieces that make the most sense for you.
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I would love to see an eventual convergence between these two projects as well.
All right. With that note, we're out of time. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate you giving an update, and have a great week. We'll see you next time.